and good evening. I'm Melisa, Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, of course, the news of the day has been the cabinet announcement, Malaysia's new cabinet lineup. Breaking with tradition, Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin did not name a Deputy Prime Minister, but instead he named 4 senior ministers, former PKR leader Datuk Sri Azmin Ali as Minister of International Trade and Industry, UMNO's Datuk Sri Ismail Sabri Yaakob as Defence Minister, GPS's Datuk Sri Fadilah Yusof as Works Minister, and Bersatu's Muhammad Razi Jidin as Education Minister. Now, what's also interesting is among the prominent non-politicians included in the lineup is CIMB Group CEO Tengku Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz, who will be made Finance Minister after taking his oath as Senator. And Federal Territories Mufti Zulkifli Muhammad Al-Bakri also will assume the post of Senator, after which he will be the Minister in charge of Religious Affairs. Now, Sharaad, there was a long list of ministers being announced. What struck you the most in the cabinet lineup today?
Oh, Melisa, there are so many stories to tell from today because this comes out of the crisis. We had a week-long crisis. We had the naming of Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin as the Prime Minister. Then he took quite a considerable amount of time to name his cabinet, much longer than the Pakatan Harapan government did when it came to power in 2018. Now, so many stories. Some of my favorites are, what happened to Azmin Ali and the 10, MPs that defected from PKR. Well, they were handsomely rewarded. So you might say the lesson from this is defection does pay. 3 ministers, 6 deputy ministers, and 1 deputy speaker. The only person of that initial group of 11 that left PKR that didn't get a position or something in this particular configuration was Barubian, who actually returned to PKR. What's your favorite story?
Well, women representation, of course. 5 female cabinet ministers, 4 deputy ministers. That was the same as the previous government's lineup. But I think what's also important is remembering that this cabinet is bigger. So Muhyiddin's cabinet has 32 portfolios. Tun Dr. Mahathir's cabinet had 27 ministers. I believe the deputy prime minister held 2 portfolios. So because this is an extended cabinet, it's a much bigger cabinet, it also means that in relative terms, female representation has fallen. So I think that was what struck me the most.
But of course, unlike the Pakatan Harapan government that came in with a manifesto, with pledges to address gender representation and such, the Perikatan Nasional has no such manifesto. So what are you going to hold them against, right? What yardstick you hold them against?
Well, I'm also quite interested to see going forward whether there will be more female appointments to GLCs, to major agencies, to GLICs, and those are the quite important things I would say.
Right, of course, and Pakatan Harapan as a government did celebrate the fact that it made some very important appointments important appointments of women were made during its tenure.
Right.
Now, another interesting story, of course, and I think this is a much more nuanced story to tell, is the story of Sarawak and Sarawak representation in the cabinet lineup. So cabinet, deputy ministers and such, many more than we've ever had, because it is a Perikatan Nasional GPS government. Remember, that's actually the full name, the character of this particular administration. Also notable, the daughter of the governor of Sarawak, Taib Mahmud, his daughter is in cabinet as a deputy minister.
Right.
So, fascinating because the complexities of Sarawak and its politics and the narrative that we want to spin around, this, whether it's a question of, a different federation, a federation of equals that, Sarawak and Sabah have been asking for all these years.
Quite interesting. I also want to take a look at the average age of this cabinet, as particularly the Youth and Sports Ministry. Rizal American is now the Youth and Sports Minister. He is about 47 years old.
Not 74.
Sorry, 47 years old.
But he might as well, because he's broken the ceiling of what it means to be young.
Well, 20 years older than the former Youth and Sports Minister Syed Saddiq.
And we had the Undi 18, activists on the show just a couple of days ago asking this precise question. And they were also dubious about the ability for the Perikatan Nasional GPS government to actually have a young minister spot. They're saying that, well, there's just no candidates from which to choose.
That's right. Also, quite interesting is the framing of this cabinet, whether this is seen to be a technocratic cabinet. I'm also quite interested to see that I believe there are 7 cabinet ministers from Kuttan represented.
Right, okay. And now, the technocratic thing I think is very interesting because I think it's part of a spin. Now, if you listened very carefully to what the Prime Minister was saying in his speech, he never mentioned the expression technocratic. He talked about a functioning cabinet. He talked about a cabinet that delivers. These were his words. The technocratic framing is really a spin, I think, from media that's trying to talk up this administration, try to kind of lift it above the messy politics that we've had over the last 2 weeks. So how do you do that? By saying that this is a cabinet of integrity, this is a cabinet that's full of technocrats. I don't know if the facts actually bear that out, Melisa.
We're going to find out more after this. We're going to be speaking to experts and analysts to put this new cabinet into perspective. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan. Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin announced his new cabinet today, just a week after he was sworn in as 8th Prime Minister. Joining us on the line to share her thoughts on the lineup is Bridget Welsh, Honorary Research Associate of the Asia Research Institute at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Bridget, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Do you think, Bridget, this lineup will be able to satisfy Muhyiddin's parliamentary base, meaning, of course, UMNO and PAS MPs, especially given that the leaders of these two parties were not included in the cabinet?
I think at this point, I think it has a good promise of actually being able to accommodate those, because it represents different factions within those parties, and it's seen as not coming with as much baggage as people expected. In fact, many people are willing to give Muhyiddin in this cabinet a sense of goodwill because he did not include some of the more senior members, both in UMNO and PAS, that would have been more baggage for him to be able to have to carry.
Bridget, do you think Muhyiddin in some ways was kind of trapped? I mean, on one hand, he needs to establish international credibility. He could not associate himself with a previous administration or political parties that are seen as tainted by allegations of corruption. At the same time, he does need to satisfy that parliamentary base. And there have been, voices from UMNO leaders saying, despite, Zahid Hamidi's protestations about not wanting a position, that he should be given one. It would be unbecoming and unfair for him to be left out.
Well, I think they're clearly going to be grumbling, especially within UMNO. I think there's not every party within the factions within the party have been satisfied. And I think you're also correct that this is a cabinet of accommodation. We've seen it's a much larger cabinet. This number of parliamentary ministers have moved from 25 to 31, but deputy ministers have moved from 23 to 28. So it is about trying to build that base. And I think, there is going to be not only attention for who was not included in the cabinet, but there's also attention in how the cabinet is going to work together, because it has a new type of structure with these 4 ministers that are supposed to be senior, but at the same juncture, this is something that Malaysia is not used to. And so the issue of power sharing within the cabinet, I think, is going to be a challenge.
Do you think observers like yourself, Bridget, are going to be looking at the potential instability within the lineup, or looking at that aspect of it? If you remember Tun Dr. Mahathir at the end of, I think, the first year of Pakatan Harapan, saying that he was quite pleased that his government was still intact. Do you think Muhyiddin Yassin is going to have that same problem at the end of this year?
I think he's going to have challenges to manage the different parties within his coalition. I think this cabinet shows how much he's had to accommodate the different factions. But I think there's some very interesting features of this cabinet, I think, that need to be raised. We have 2 non-politicians who've been brought in that try to sort of appeal build Muhyiddin's legitimacy within larger sections outside of the traditional political arena. So, of course, the new finance minister, Zafar Tunku Abdul Aziz, which is reaching out to the private sector, and, of course, also the FD Mufti, Zulkifli Ahmad al-Bakri. And I think he's going to be it's interesting because many of the religious members of this cabinet have strong TV followings and also represent parts of the religious establishment. So I think that's a very interesting aspect of this cabinet. I think also, one of the big issues that's going to be raised is how inclusive it is, or how this is the first time there's only one Chinese minister, full minister in cabinet. There are 4 deputy ministers, but most of the time the deputy ministers don't have the same powers. So in this case, I think this is going to send sort of repercussions on questions of inclusion. And of course, the issue as well is now that PAS is at the government, who are these people? And one of them is a lawyer, 2 of them are ustads. Both of the ustads have very wide TV following, but at the same time, a couple of them, one in particular, is seen as having much more confrontational views. From Kuala Nurus, YB Khairuddin.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that you brought those things up, Bridget, the prospect, the idea of an inclusive cabinet. And I'm just wondering, Muhyiddin has mentioned a functional cabinet. Some media are trying to frame this as a technocratic cabinet. Now, do you think this narrative is persuasive?
Well, one person doesn't make a technocratic cabinet. I think that there are, this is a cabinet with a lot of experience. I mean, more than half of the cabinet have been ministers in the last 2 governments, and many of them there are many capable administrators. But some of the cabinet are also some of the weakest performers in previous governments, in particular the most recent one. So I think there are sort of mixed aspects in terms of administration. I think also that, a technocratic government is also someone that has very clear powers. And one of the issues in terms of economic policy making in the previous government was that there were many different cooks cooking at the same time. And right now you have a technocratic person who's been brought in from the private sector as the Ministry of Finance, but there are also other very powerful players that are actually politicians that are also in other spheres of economic policy. So how they're going to coordinate is going to be very interesting, and I think also somewhat challenging because of the way the new structure has been set up around the senior minister position.
Bridget, some concerns, some segments of Malaysia society very concerned about the reform agenda that the Pakatan Harapan had brought to the kind of center stage of Malaysian life. In the speech today, the Prime Minister did not mention reform. He spoke about economic challenges and delivering for the people on that score. Do you think that this is a government that's not going to be necessarily committed to institutional reform, the kinds of things that in fact have created some of the bottlenecks in Malaysian society?
Well, I think it's pretty clear at this juncture that the missing words of reform do send messages and do not instill confidence that there is a sense of wanting to shift and change some of the fundamental institutions and practices. And I think many of the indicators of the individuals involved show capable hands, but not necessarily hands that represent kind of alternative visions or alternative ideas, or more fundamentally wanting to shift and change a system. And while many of the individuals, rightly so, do not have ongoing corruption cases against them, many of them have had charges associated with issues of integrity and allegations that also create a cloud over this current cabinet.
And Bridget, lastly, what do you think is the international reception to Muhyiddin Yassin's administration and this government? Do you think it's going to be positive? We had word that the US was not going to send money coming from the 1MDB case back to Malaysia. What do you think is going to be the international repercussions?
I think that overseas, people want Malaysia to do well. I think they're looking to look to the individuals to see how they can perform. There is a sense of the recognition of the economic crisis and the issues of the coronavirus are significant. So I think there's considerable goodwill. At the same time, I think there's a lot more watchfulness over this cabinet than there has been in the past. And so the expectations will be that there should be some sort of movement and movement forward in terms of the sense of the direction of the country. And I think there are concerns about the issues of reform and whether or not those will be sustained. And at this point, this has been a very mixed signal in that latter issue.
All right, Bridget, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us on Consider This with me, Melisa, Idris and Sharaad, Kuttan. We're going to continue our discussion on the newly announced cabinet lineup. Joining us on the line now, we have Yassin, fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Yassin, thank you for joining us this evening. So I want to start with your initial impression from this cabinet lineup. Is this lineup a picture of stability, Yassin?
Well, I think people, of course, are breathing a sigh of relief when you don't see some of those, shall we say, potential members who are sort of mired in corruption and various other scandals. So most of these members, as the Prime Minister said, have been vetted by the Anti-Corruption Commission, and hopefully they will remain relatively clean. They are I think the division between those, shall we say, more core ministries, which are still held by the leaders of various political parties, but there are some, shall we say, more functional ministries, such as health ministry and so on, which are now held by some of those professionals. For example, health ministry is held by a medical doctor. Yeah.
Yassin, regardless of the shape and the composition of the cabinet, the issue is the Prime Minister of the day has to rely on UMNO and PAS as his political base in Parliament. He has no government without them. The kinds of influence and strength and power they have and leverage they have over him will be considerable. Is that something that observers will also be looking at beyond the question of who's in the cabinet and who was not allowed in, as it were?
Well, indeed, because UMNO is, shall we say, the largest component party in the coalition. So, of course, they take the lion's share of these cabinet seats. And of course, you will see the cabinet will be to a large extent dominated by UMNO. By surprise is actually that PAS, with its quite considerable number of seats, they have only, according to my count, perhaps only 3 cabinet positions, and those are not necessarily positions which are really sort of in line with their political struggle.
Okay.
I think we are talking about some sort of primary industries and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
So on that note, now I'm just wondering, there had been concerns that this would be a Muslim-dominant, ethnically non-representative government. Have those concerns panned out?
Well, of course, the political reality is this coalition consists of largely Malay members of parliament. Therefore, the sort of the shape of the new cabinet would have to be a predominantly Malay one, because, well, unless you are really appointing a lot of senators, you don't have a lot of non-Malay senators. So indeed, that is indeed an overwhelmingly Malay cabinet, with some token representations from non-Malays, from East Malaysians, and so on. We would need to let it run for a few months to see how it will pan out. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, 2 out of the 4 senator positions are actually going to MCA political leaders. But I want to ask you, Ihsan, about the Sarawak story, because I think that's also one of the big stories of today. Huge amount of Sarawakian representation. For a country even like Singapore and those of the region, watching this federation as it changes, do you think there are concerns, the looseness of the federation, the demands of autonomy from Sarawak? Do you think these are things to watch?
Well, Sarawak has been extremely vocal in its demand for more autonomy, for more devolution of rights and privileges and so on. But in the latest turn of political events, they decided to sort of support this coalition. In return, they are rewarded with a number of quite important ministries, including one of these senior ministers being from Sarawak. So how they will square that with, within the state of Sarawak, their consistent demand for more rights versus the federal level and so on. I mean, I don't quite understand how they would sort of reconcile those 2 points, shoring up the federal government and then sort of fighting for state rights. Yeah.
Right. Well, I know you mentioned that it's early days. Still, we have to give them some time to see the trajectory of this new cabinet. But I'm just wondering, do you expect policy continuity, especially in the management of the country's economy?
Well, I think this country would have sort of a very stable economic policy, actually. Even if we had a change of government 2 years ago and now this latest change of government, I'm quite confident that we, as a country, will still be very much pro-investment, pro-business, and in general, very welcoming of foreign investments here.
And lastly, Ihsan, your take on the international credibility of this government. What do you think foreign observers, foreign governments are looking at when they see this new government and this new lineup?
Well, this cabinet lineup, I think, will not change the opinions of the international community a lot, because I think what they are looking for is some sort of semblance of legitimacy. For example, a clear-cut parliamentary majority for this government, because until today we still don't quite know who exactly consists of their parliamentary majority. So until such time, I think you will not see a lot of congratulatory messages pouring in for this new government here.
All right, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing those insights. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. We'll be back with you same time tomorrow night, 10 p.m. I'm Melisa Idris with me, Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for tonight. Thank you for watching and have a great evening.